I fell in love with my cousin. Disclaimer, this is not my story time with me on Instagram. 6 months ago, I broke up with my fiance. He was cheating on me with my best friend. And on top of that, I found out that he was bi. He had threesomes with her and two of my other friends. He was an absolutely horrible person. Now, my cousin and I didn't grow up very close. Not until everyone in my family found out that I had to break up with my fiance because he was a horrible person. He came to my rescue. Came over to my apartment when he found out, and he just talked to me. We talked for 6 hours. He even gave me the name to a therapist, which actually helped me. And then he just started inviting me out everywhere because he knew that I had no friends. All of my friends hooked up with my fiance. So my cousin was actually in the middle of breaking up with his girlfriend too, which is why he was so good about helping me out. Before I knew it, we were like best friends, hanging out all the time. We would go out to dinners, and this is where I started getting confused. It felt like we were in a relationship, minus the love and sex. He would pick me up and drop me off. He would pay for everything, would open the car door for me. He introduced me to all of his friends, and he just made me feel really taken care of. And then it happened. I fell in love. Go to part 2. I fell in love with my cousin. After 6 months of just hanging out with him and feeling like we're kind of in a relationship but not really, I just started falling in love. He was just the perfect guy. He was so handsome and such a gentleman, and he had all the qualities that I would have wanted in a partner. When I realized that I started falling in love with my cousin, I felt sick to my stomach. I just couldn't reconcile. So I did the only thing I thought I should do. I was honest with him and I told him the truth. But then something happened I did not expect. As I was telling him all of this, he just grabbed me and kissed me. And I know that is so messed up, but he told me that he had been feeling the same about me. This whole time, we were trying to help each other get over our exes. I mean, I knew I felt something for a reason. This is gonna sound like a mean girls thing, but he is my second cousin. We decided to start dating, and after 2 months of hiding our relationship, we were both honest with our parents. We got everyone together and just told them the truth. My mother nearly fainted, but his parents were actually okay with it, and this is why. He's adopted. They adopted him because they couldn't have children, but they were planning on never telling him. Not until this happened. Parents still felt kind of weird about it, but they had to accept it. We moved in together, and I'm pretty sure he's gonna ask me to be his wife. What the heck is life? Do you think this is crazy? My husband wants me to use a strap-on. What do I do? This is not my story time. It's me on Instagram. Hubby and I have been married for 4 months. That is not a very long time. Before we got married, he told me that he was bi, and I totally accepted this. This was actually never a problem for me because I am also bi. We are very open-minded as a couple. We even started going to some swingers clubs. This allowed us to explore safely and without us getting jealous or anything weird happening. We did this for 3 weekends straight, but then we decided to take a break. It was just a bit too much. Also, there was a couple within the swingers club that was constantly asking us to come over to their place. And we kept saying no because that was a big no-no for us. Anything that would happen would have to stay in the club, if you know what I mean. But 3 things happened as a consequence of the exposure to all of this. I realized that my sexy life with my husband was not that great. He's not the most experienced person, but I knew all of this when we got married. I just want him to learn and be open to learning. But so far, he has changed nothing. And he also started preferring men when we went to the swingers club. Now, I did notice this, but I didn't want to say anything to him because it was kind of awkward. And then finally, he asked me for a strap. Now, this completely took me by surprise. I didn't know he'd want to ever do something like that. The problem is that I don't want to. I actually don't think I would be comfortable doing that to him. But at the same time, I don't want him doing that with anyone else, which is exactly what he told me when I told him that I didn't want to do it. He actually told me that he wants to find somebody at the swingers club who could do it for him. We even talked about him going by himself, which I have to say yes to because otherwise I don't want to be responsible for that. All of this has become very complicated and I really regret going to the club in the first place. I also regret us being so open with these things because now he's asking for more and more. And I am not comfortable with him doing any of these things. When I told him that I wasn't comfortable with this, he got mad at me and he's been giving me the cold shoulder ever since. We were engaged for 8 months, so we really actually don't know each other as well as I want to. And I did tell my best friend about this and she doesn't think it's normal. In fact, she doesn't think that we should have gone to the swingers club and that I need to retract on basically everything and essentially ask for a monogamous relationship. Now I'm afraid that he's going to want to leave me if I do this. Am I overreacting? Should I just do it to please him? Or should I actually be freaking out? Because I don't think this is normal. I don't want to do that to my husband. Ew. What should I do? Bye. I caught my dad and my best friend making out. Disclaimer, is not my story time. It's going to be on Instagram. By the way, my dad has known my bestie since I was 4 years old. My bestie and I both just turned 21, and everything happened at our birthday party. But here's a little background. My mom and dad got divorced when I was 15, and this hit me really hard, and my best friend was always there for me. And I mean she was there for me. I would call her any time of the day to complain and cry. We live close to each other, so sometimes I would just run over to her house at 2 in the morning and sleep with her. My parents were always fighting, and I just needed to leave my house. After this, her and I just became even closer. Finally, when my parents got divorced, there was peace in the house. My dad moved into an apartment not far away, birthday, and things were pretty much okay. I did not resent my dad for leaving. I knew he was really unhappy with my mom, and she wasn't happy with him, so the divorce needed to happen. Okay, back to the present. For our 21st birthday, we decided to celebrate it together. Our birthdays are 2 weeks apart, so we just wanted to have one big party. When I told my parents, for some reason my dad really wanted to get involved. He wanted to hire caterers, and he even hired a full-on bar, which meant him and my bestie started spending more time together. It gets worse. Go to part 2. I caught my dad and my best friend making out. Ew. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's not me on Instagram. As my bestie and I were planning our dual birthday party, my dad started insisting on getting us caterers and a full-on bar. This meant thousands of dollars. But I know my dad has money, so we accepted. But this meant that he started spending more time with us. He was always coming around to my mom's house, which is where we were gonna have the party. Him and my bestie actually started meeting alone because they were gonna plan some things while I was in school. One day, my best friend and I are watching a movie together, and that's when I see a text message from my dad come in through her phone. I asked her, what does my dad want? And that's when she lied. She said, oh yeah, that's not your dad. And I said, it says bestie's dad. This time she said, oh, sorry, yeah, you're right. Must be something about the party, I'll check it later. How could it cross my mind that something was going on with my dad and my bestie? After 3 weeks of planning our birthday, it's finally arrived. We had 70 of our friends' family showing up. We even decided to match outfits. She wore pink and I wore green. As the party starts, my boyfriend comes up to me and says, I think I just saw your bestie hugging your dad in the kitchen. Run over there and I find them passionately making out on top of the counter. And he had his hand up her skirt. Part 3 is I caught my dad and my best friend making out with his hand up her skirt. Disclaimer, it's not my story time, it's not me on Instagram. As I'm walking into the kitchen, I see he has her pinned up against the counter. Ew. Let me remind you, there are almost 100 people in the house because we are celebrating my birthday. When they see me, they just separate and pretend like nothing happened. But I asked them, what were you guys doing? My dad wipes his hands on his pants, and I said, Dad, I saw where you had your hand. And then he did something I never thought he would do. He tried to gaslight me. He said that he didn't have his hand there, and that I was just seeing things. Thankfully, my bestie saw the look on my face, and that's when she tells him, we need to tell her the truth. My bestie confesses that they're dating, and that they're in love, and that they're gonna move in together. And I kicked them both out of the party and just enjoyed it. When I told my mom, she was really heartbroken. The worst part is they did end up moving in together. They keep trying to get me to come over to have dinner, but I refuse to. My loyalty is to my mother, and I cannot believe that my best friend would betray me like that. She sent me a really heartfelt message, and I was tempted to reply, but I'm not really sure if I should. Also, I can't forgive my dad for trying to gaslight me. Am I overreacting? What should she do? Bye. Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. I'm 24 years old and my boyfriend is 21. According to him, he has never been with any girl who's had cellulite before, or even an ounce of body fat. Yes, I know what you're thinking, he's a total asshole, which in that sense, he is. But the rest of the time, he's completely fine and actually sweet. We met last year at a friend's party. At the party, I instantly fell in love with him. I thought he was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. And it was reciprocated. I saw him from across the room and he made eye contact. A few minutes later, he walked over to me and just struck up a conversation. I know that people present themselves the way they want to be seen, especially when they're trying to impress someone they're attracted to. He started telling me about how he's studying to be a doctor, how he volunteers at animal shelters, and that every single weekend he also volunteers at the soup kitchen. Everything he said was absolutely perfect. By the end of the night, he had asked me out on a date and I said yes. I did explain to him that I didn't want anything serious and he said that was totally fine. I was trying to focus on my studies, so having a boyfriend was not in my plans. But after we went on 7 dates, he asked me to be his girlfriend. He wouldn't take no for an answer. After about a month, I finally said yes. Mind you, at this point, he hadn't seen me naked, not even in a bathing suit. The very night that I said yes to being his girlfriend, he asked me to come over to his place. He made a whole gourmet dinner, even bought super expensive wine. So we ended up doing it for the first time that night. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing he said to me was, do you ever exercise? I was shocked. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimers are not my story time, I sent me on Instagram. That's when he said point blank, super serious, do you ever exercise? I just stared at him. I had literally just woken up in his bed after the first time we ever did it. Then I thought he must be joking. So I started to laugh a little, and then he says, no, seriously, do you ever exercise? I said, sometimes. Then he told me, you should really try to work out at least 5 times a week. I went home and finally texted him saying that I wasn't comfortable with the way he spoke to me. That's when he said that what he said to me was completely normal, and that I shouldn't be offended. This was all in text, by the way. That's when he sends me another text message saying, you know, you wouldn't have as much cellulite as you do if you didn't eat so much fast food, and if you exercise 5 times a week like I told you. I didn't reply to him for the rest of the day. Later that day, he shows up to my apartment and says, you know, I should feel comfortable enough to tell you what I think about you. He somehow ended up making me feel bad and I ended up apologizing. Obviously, after that, I became really self-conscious about my cellulite and my entire body. So anytime we were together, I would always stay under the covers. By the way, my boyfriend doesn't have a great body. He's super soft and pudgy. Last week, he told me that he had abs though. Part 3 is story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, it's not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. One day, he pulls up his shirt and says, look, I have abs. Which, no, he doesn't. He's super soft and has a thick layer of fat on
on it. I smirked and he said, what? And I said, you don't have abs. Then he says, yes, I do. I'm in better shape than you. By the way, he said this in front of his friends, so I was super embarrassed and stayed quiet the entire day. He finally went to drop me off and I was so happy to be home. But he decided to come upstairs with me. Got straight into my PJs. And when I came out of my bedroom, he says, wow, your cellulite's getting worse by the day. That's when I finally broke. I turned around and started yelling at him. I told him he had no right to talk about my body the way that he did, and that all he does is objectify me. He started laughing and said, wow, those are big words. And that when we met, he thought that I was in better shape. My clothes obviously tricked him. I'm 5'4" and I weigh 130 pounds. I am by no means fat, but the way that he was bullying me was making me think that I was. That's when I told him that he was the fat one, and that he had a big, huge beer belly. I also told him that his face was super round, but that didn't bother me. Oh yeah, and that his hairy back was gross. Then he said, wow, I can't believe you're attacking my physical appearance. Then he stormed out of my apartment, and as soon as he left, I felt happy. We haven't spoken in 4 days. I'm afraid that if he asks me to get back with him, I will. But I should just break up with him, right? What should I do?
Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I come from a really big family. My mom has 5 sisters and 1 brother, and my dad has 4 brothers and sisters. All of them have their own kids, so I have a lot of cousins. And this means we have a lot of family get-togethers. Every single weekend, someone is hosting a party. We all get together and eat, and it's actually a really nice time. But there's always that one creepy uncle. In my case, it's my mom's brother. He's 46-year-old and has never married, but he's a bachelor. He's got money, so he basically has a bunch of sugar babies. Whenever my family tells him that he needs to get married, he says he'll never get married to anybody. He thinks women only exist for the pleasure of men. When I turned 16, I noticed that he would stare at me a lot. At first, it was just staring. Every now and again, he never did anything really creepy then, but just the staring was enough for me. I never told my mom about it then, not until I turned 18. This is when he started making comments like, wow, you're growing into your body, or wow, you got great hips. He would make comments about how I was growing up, like, ew. He even told my dad that he needed to keep me away from guys because I was growing up really quickly. And because of my curves, men would think that I was a woman. This is when I finally told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable. She thought it was funny at first, so I avoided him at all costs. Part 2. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's me on Instagram. When I told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable, she laughed it off. She thought it was funny. She said, oh, you know how he is. So from that point on, I basically avoided my uncle every time we were at a family event. When I turned 20, this is when things got even worse. He would ask me things like if I was a virgin, or if I had a boyfriend, if I had ever been on dates. And one time he even told me that he would get very jealous if I ended up bringing a guy to one of our family events. One time he complimented me on the dress that I was wearing, so after that, I only wore baggy clothes to family events. The fact that I had to change the way that I dress so that he could control himself makes me sick. I finally told my mom again that my uncle was always bothering me. That's when she told me that the world is filled with men like him, and that all I needed to do was just ignore him. So I told my dad everything. My dad took it a little more seriously and told my uncle that he needed to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed. Part 3 is up.
Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I'm 24 years old and my boyfriend is 21. According to him, he has never been with any girl who's had cellulite before, or even an ounce of body fat. Yes, I know what you're thinking. He's a total asshole, which in that sense he is, but the rest of the time he's completely fine and actually sweet. We met last year at a friend's party. At the party, I instantly fell in love with him. I thought he was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my entire life, and it was reciprocated. I saw him from across the room and he made eye contact. A few minutes later, he walked over to me and just struck up a conversation. I know that people present themselves the way they want to be seen, especially when they're trying to impress someone they're attracted to. He started telling me about how he's studying to be a doctor, how he volunteers at animal shelters, and that every single weekend he also volunteers at the soup kitchen. Everything he said was absolutely perfect. By the end of the night, he had asked me out on a date and I said yes. I did explain to him that I didn't want anything serious and he said that was totally fine. I was trying to focus on my studies, so having a boyfriend was not in my plans. But after we went on 7 dates, he asked me to be his girlfriend. He wouldn't take no for an answer. After about a month, I finally said yes. Mind you, at this point, he hadn't seen me naked, not even in a bathing suit. The very night that I said yes to being his girlfriend, he asked me to come over to his place. He made a whole gourmet dinner. Story time about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. Tell you that last month I made $60,000. It's clear this is not my story time and send me on Instagram. So at the beginning, I had to lie about my age. I'm really 36 years old, but I say I'm 22. I do look a lot younger than I am, and of course, I get filler and Botox. I started my Instagram account 6 years ago. My inspirations were Anna Cherie, Amanda Lee, Sam JoJo, and Abigail Ratchford. I mean, Abigail Ratchet. I basically copied all of these girls' pictures. Within a month of starting my Instagram account, I had 10,000 followers. And yes, all of them were males. But I didn't really start making money until 2018. You know, like every other girl on Instagram, I signed up for OF, and that's when I started making serious money. But I was also making money from Instagram. Brands would send me clothes and watches and protein powders, stuff like that. Eventually, I became an ambassador for one of the biggest Instagram clothing stores. I think we all know what I'm talking about. Fashion Hova, and I started making a lot of money then. So I basically started living above my means. I got myself a new apartment in Beverly Hills, and it was $6,000 a month. I also got myself a Mercedes, and I would exclusively shop at Air One. I would also go shopping at Rodeo Drive almost every day because I wanted the paparazzi to get pictures of me. And I even called the paparazzi on me a few times, so I had to pay them like $2,000 out of pocket. So yeah, I was spending a lot of money. Whatever money I got that month, I would literally spend it by the end. One month I spent $25,000 going out with friends. I would usually pick up the bill. This is what started getting me into trouble. Part 2 is Storytime about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. After I spent the $25,000 in 1 month, I decided I needed another income source. So I thought of escorting. One of my very good friends in LA was also an escort, and she told me about it, but I was like, I can't do that. But one day I called her and she told me everything. She gets contacted through Instagram by very, very rich men, like billionaires. I honestly didn't believe her at first, but then she showed me receipts. Her bank account had more than $1 million in it. She told me that she had only been doing it for 6 months. She put me in contact with several people and they had to verify a bunch of my stuff. Then after a week, I was finally in. I was really scared. I had to go get my passport renewed. This meant that I was going to be traveling internationally with men that I didn't know. A few days later, I get a message on Instagram from an account. The guy that owned this account was clearly very rich. It wasn't him contacting me, it was his assistant. He got my information and 2 days later, I was on a private plane. I landed in a foreign country. I spent the entire weekend with this guy. He didn't speak English. Basically took me around his city and showed me off for his friends. I honestly didn't feel uncomfortable at any point and he didn't try anything. In fact, he was actually super shy, but his friends on the other hand were really handsy. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how I became an Instagram model / escort for billionaires. That's when his friends started getting really handsy. We were in a really expensive high-rise and the apartment was literally worth millions. And I knew that all of these guys were used to getting whatever they wanted. One of the friends actually grabbed my arm and told me to sit on his lap, but I told him I couldn't. He wasn't the one that hired me to be there, so I had to go straight to the guy that hired me. I told him that his friends were making me uncomfortable and he said, okay, we should leave then. I was actually shocked that he listened to what I wanted. Now one of my regular clients and I travel with him almost every 2 months. So let me tell you how much he paid me. For the 3-day weekend, I ended up with $50,000. Yep, that's right. But let me tell you a little about the dark side of this. A few jobs later, I ended up with somebody who was completely crazy. I ended up going to Vegas with this guy. He was approximately 10 years younger than me and was filthy rich. But he was also a complete psycho. He bought me this whole outfit that he wanted me to wear the entire night. I told him I was more comfortable in my clothes. I was wearing a Fendi dress. It looked great. That's when he said, no, you're gonna wear this. I ended up walking around Vegas in a micro mini skirt and a bikini top. By the end of this night, he was getting really aggressive. I tried to stay quiet, hoping that he would just forget that I was in his car. Suddenly, he turned to look at me and wanted me to do something. When I said no, he grabbed me by the hair and told me that he owned me for the night. Then he said, I'll add an extra $20,000 in there for you. And it does get worse. But now I learned to save my money. I no longer pay for my friends' drinks and food. I still have my $6,000 apartment and I upgraded my car. I live like a princess. I also bought my parents a house though. It was definitely one of the happiest days of my life. And believe it or not, I actually did end up finding love. My boyfriend is okay with my job, but he just asked me to be safe. Of course, he asked me every day to quit because he wants to support me, but he can't give me the life I've given myself. What should I do?
Storytime about how I married a married man.
Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sending me on Instagram. Years ago, I met this guy that I thought was really cute. Stupid and naive, and I believed everything he said. I worked in customer service. He came into my job one day and just started flirting with me, and I was like thrilled. My job was really boring. This cute guy comes in and just starts talking to me, and I just fall in love. I'm not exaggerating. I know it's pathetic. I couldn't believe that he was talking to me and that he was interested in me. The next day, he asked me for my phone number, and I gave it to him. I went on one date, and I was legit in love. It starts to get creepy. He was 20 years older than me, and you could say he GROOMED'd me. See, I didn't know what was happening. I was 19, I had never had a boyfriend, and I barely had ever been kissed. He played me like a fiddle. After 2 weeks of going on dates, he finally kissed me. I knew that he was the man I wanted to marry. But when I told my coworker about him, she told me that he was married. I asked him about it. He told me that my coworker must have been mistaking him for his brother because his brother and him had similar names and the brother was married. 2 days later, I asked one of his friends about it. That's when his friend tells me that he doesn't even have a brother and that he had been married for 15 years to a girl that was also 20 years younger than him. Even knowing this, I still married him. And you'll never guess how. Part 2 is already up. Storytime about how I married a guy who was already married. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's on Instagram. Even though I knew he was already married to somebody else, and even though I knew he lied to me about already being married, I still went ahead and married him. I was completely obsessed with him. Because he was already legally married to somebody else, we decided to use a different name for him, and somehow it worked. We actually drove 5 hours away to get married, used fake names, filed in a different state, and then we drove back to our hometown, where literally no one knew we were married. It was our little secret. But then the poo hit the fan. He kept promising that he would leave his wife. But one day, I'm having dinner with my parents at a restaurant, and guess who shows up? My husband with his wife. And boy, did they look happy. He was all over her, kissing her neck and her hands. Not only until he realized that I was in the restaurant did he stop. Then he actually had the audacity to come to my table, introduce himself to my parents, and tell him that he knew me from my job. All the while, his wife was sitting at the table looking at me. And in that moment, I knew that she knew something was up. It's like she stared straight into my soul. She must have seen the way that I was looking at him, because she ran up to the table and introduced herself to me and my parents. When she tried to shake my hand, I didn't shake it back. My parents told me I was being rude, so I forced myself to shake her hand. 2 days later, she calls me and asks me what's up. But I lied and said that her husband was just a friend. Then I got an idea. I decided to be her friend. I asked her out to coffee and we had a great time. And little did she know that she was sitting with her husband's new wife. I feel like this way I can try to control their relationship from the inside. I confessed everything to my mom and she thinks I'm crazy. I think I'm a little crazy too. Am I completely wrong for this? Story time about how my grandma got married when she was 14 years old. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. So just picture it. I'm sitting with my 94-year-old grandma in the kitchen, and suddenly she starts talking about my grandpa. My grandpa passed away almost 10 years ago. And to be fair, they did have a wonderful marriage. By all accounts, and by all of my family's accounts, they were totally in love until the moment he took his last breath. Here's how the story goes. The first time they met, she was 12 years old. He had just gotten back from the war. She was walking home from school with her backpack, and my 27-year-old grandpa pulls up in his car. He starts to tell her that she's going to be his future wife, and that he's going to talk to her parents so that they can get married. He kept inviting her into his car, but she kept saying no. He followed her home from school every single day. As my grandma is telling the story, everyone is laughing, except for me. Finally, one day he followed her to her house, knocked on the door, and requested to speak to my great-grandfather. They spoke for an hour, and that's when my great-grandpa promised my grandma to my grandpa, and he gave them permission to get married when she was 14. At first, he wanted them to get to know each other, so they started going on dates. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. This is when my great-grandfather promised my 12-year-old grandma to my 27-year-old grandfather. My great-grandpa thought that it would be best they wait 2 years so that they can get married when she's 14. In the meantime, he suggested that they start going out on dates. Yes, a 12-year-old girl and a 27-year-old man. By the way, as my grandma is telling this story, all of my cousins are laughing at this. I'm trembling in my seat. She explained to us that for those 2 years, my grandfather was on his best behavior, and that essentially they read books together, they walked together by the lake, and he would take her out to see movies. She said at the time it was a big deal. Going to the movies was like a big treat. I guess it made me feel better knowing that he didn't try to do anything to her at the time. Still, it's absolutely disgusting. Finally, the 2 years passed, and at this point, they're totally in love. They get married. Both their families attended this wedding. How did no one in their families think it was inappropriate? Watching a 14-year-old get married to a 29-year-old man? But it gets worse. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14 years old and he was 29. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. This is the third and last part. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. 2 years pass and they get married. My grandma even told us that the night of their wedding, my great-grandparents gifted them a night at a hotel so that they could have some privacy. You can imagine what happened. My grandmother described it as the most liberating night of her life. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Their first baby was born right before she turned 15, and then she got pregnant again at 15, and then at 17, and then at 18, 19, and finally 20. My grandfather got into oil in his late 20s. He made about $1 million by the time he was 35, so he was able to give them a very comfortable life. He purchased a manor. They had 3 housekeepers, 1 butler, and 4 nannies, and they had a really happy life. My grandma says my grandpa was always affectionate with her, and she said they blessed their bed every single night. After she finishes telling the story, all of my cousins laugh and think it's cute. I was disturbed. I asked her why it was okay to get married at such a young age. And then I said, would you have wanted me to get married when I was 14? That's when she said that times were just different back then. The war was happening, and people didn't know if they would live or die. She also said that when a catch like my grandfather turned up, most parents were looking for a man like my grandfather to marry off their daughters. Grandpa was educated, handsome, driven, had great work ethic, and he took care of her, which is what he promised my great-grandpa. And then when the children came, he more than took care of them. He even took care of my great-grandparents too. He ended up moving them into the manor in their old age, and they were fully taken care of by the staff. Apparently, the manor was big enough to fit in 4 families. Now, I loved my grandfather. He was a great, kind man, and I myself benefited off the generational wealth. He paid for my education, and I'm now a lawyer for it. But still, a huge part of me feels absolutely disgusted with the history of their love. Even though back then that might have been normal, I think it's horrendous. Yes, they had a great love story, but she was a child. Apparently, this was a big family secret. None of the uncles or my parents wanted us to know. I got into a huge argument with my parents for hiding this from me. They think I'm totally overreacting. Am I though? I guess I'll need more therapy. What do you think? My boyfriend confessed he got his ex-girlfriend pregnant. Disclaimer, this is not my story time with Send Me on Instagram. This girl was completely obsessed with me. She stalked me for over a month. One day my boyfriend shows up to my parents' house bawling. That's when my dad told him that he needed to leave. My parents were terrified this girl would do something to me. And that's when he just said to us, she's pregnant. A few days before we went out on our first date, they ended up hooking up one last time. Apparently she had been begging him. She swears up and down that the baby is his, but my parents don't buy it. My boyfriend now feels extremely guilty for bringing her into my life. Now my boyfriend has to take her to all the doctor's appointments, and she asked me to step aside. I didn't know what else to do, so I broke up with him. With a caveat, we're still seeing each other in secret, but this has stopped her from stalking me. Once the baby's born, there will be a paternity test. I guess I'll update you guys then. Bye. My stalker hid in my apartment for months, and it turns out it was my landlord. 3 years ago, I was trying to get out of a toxic relationship. My boyfriend was extremely controlling and possessive. He would show up to my job just to make sure that I was actually there, and after 6 months of living together, I'd had enough. I planned everything perfectly. I told my parents to meet me at our apartment at 2 in the morning. I only took my passport and my wallet and left while my ex was sleeping. After that, I had to get a restraining order from him because he kept stalking me. Needless to say, I never thought this would happen to me ever again. Moved in with my parents, and trust me, I would have lived with them forever had it not been for the fact that I landed my dream job in a different city. My parents helped me move into this really beautiful duplex. The day we moved in, we met my landlords. They were a cute couple in their 40s. They looked so kind and sweet. Once I moved in, everything was wonderful. I decorated the apartment exactly how I liked it. My dream job was amazing, and I even started dating again. But I started hearing noises. Sometimes I would hear furniture being moved upstairs. When I would run upstairs, nothing was there. And then I started hearing a man moaning. Things would be moved around when I would come home. One time I found my fridge open, and my underwear would always go missing. I decided to install cameras, and 2 days after that, I heard more moaning. I called the police immediately, and when they showed up, they searched the house. Upstairs, in a guest bedroom full of boxes, they find my landlord. He had set up a mattress, food, and his laptop, even had a bag of clothes. And of course, on his laptop, they found videos of everything. Me with boys in my bedroom doing you know what, me in the shower. This man had cameras everywhere, and his mattress was full of you know what. Thank God he was prosecuted, and his wife blamed me. I got a bigger house and moved my parents in with me. I will never date men again. What would you have done? Am I the asshole for stealing money to get a BBL? And the BBL almost killed me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time with Send Me on Instagram. I'm 27 years old, and my life changed in 2017. I went kind of viral on Instagram after I posted some bikini pictures, and then I got a bunch of male followers. And to be honest, I have zero talents. I don't know how to cook, not a good actress. I'm really not good at anything other than like posting pictures. So I decided to make Instagram my job. My dream was to be like these other IG baddies. They all had BBLs, expensive cars, and they made so much money. So I decided to get a BBL. The problem is I was totally broke. So I came up with a plan and I didn't tell anybody. I would get my followers to send me about $200 and then I would send them pictures in return. But I would promise private stuff and I never sent it. I would send them like a bikini picture here and there, but these guys couldn't get their money back. So I just started blocking everyone who sent me money. After 3 months, I had 50K. I ran over to a plastic surgeon. I got my BBL, but it was gruesome. For 3 months, the recovery was horrible. I had to wear fajas and get massages. I went on a clean diet. Finally, after 3 months, I had my dream body. And when I started posting my new body, I gained 100,000 new followers. But then after 7 months, I started feeling sick all the time. I was really tired and had all these weird symptoms. And my butt would smell bad too. It was very hard to clean my new butt. That's when my doctor told me I had an infection from the BBL. I had to go on these crazy antibiotics and I gained a bunch of weight. I looked horrible. My butt was astronomical. I was sick for 7 months. Now my body does look good again, but I regret this decision so much. I always have complications and my butt smells bad. Would you do it?